We have a promise from God that we can depend on. He said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. There isn't a whole lot in this world of change that we can count on, but here's a promise that we really can. We can depend on it in our lives. We can plan our lives around it. We can fashion our attitudes according to this promise. We can do everything in life with the knowledge that God said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. And that's a very positive thing in our life. That's something that we can be very happy about, have a good attitude because of. This was taken from Hebrews, the 13th chapter, 5th verse. It says, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. That's the King James version of the verse. I like the NIV version. Let me read that to you. Keep your lives free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And there's something very special about this. Paul, in writing this verse, he said, you can be content at any level of life because of this verse. You don't have to have a whole lot of money to be happy in life. You don't have to have a lot of the world's goods or anything that the world can give you, but you can be content with just a little bit in life because of this verse. God has promised He'd never leave us nor forsake us. This verse is very emphatic. There's no wiggle room in this verse. It says, God has said, not we may surmise or theoretically God will be with us, or perhaps. Sometimes there is a dichotomy between thought and action. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but this is one of those times. This verse is not religious doctrine. It is what God does. It's action. It's not a thought, but it's an action. It is something that God fulfills within us. We can separate these two thoughts. A lot of times we take the Bible, we take the scriptures, and we call that our doctrine. But when it comes down to this verse, we might as well take it personally, because it's an action that God does for us. He'll never leave thee. There are four aspects of this verse which I want to consider this morning. We find that this verse is of old, of ancient time. We find that it is very personal. We find that it's unalterable. And it is comprehensive. So pay attention as we go through this, and we'll hit all four of these different topics concerning this verse. God has said. Do you know of anything God has said which hasn't come true? I know that God gets the blame for a lot of things He never did say, but do you know of something that God actually said and it never came true? If it's in His Word, you can depend on it. It will happen. The story is told about a construction crew that was building a new road in a rural area, and they were knocking down all the trees that were in the path of the new road. And a road superintendent was going through there and kind of surveying where the road was going and what was happening. And he noticed a tree that had a bird's nest in it. And so he took a good close look, and he saw there were some little fledgling birds in the bird's nest that obviously couldn't fly yet. So he marked the tree so that it wouldn't be cut down. Several weeks later, the superintendent went back down through the area, and he looked at that tree. He got in a bucket truck and was lifted up so that he could look down into that bird's nest, and it was empty. So obviously the little birds had learned to fly and had let the tree down. They did. And as the tree fell, the nest separated from the tree and scattered out across the ground, and he went and looked, and woven in amongst the nest was a little piece of paper. And he pulled it out and looked at it. It was a little piece of paper torn from a Sunday school pamphlet, and written on this little piece of paper it said, "He careth for you." How true that is. He careth for you. He even cares for the little birds. He provides for them. He said, "I will not forsake you," back in ancient of times. Listen to Moses in Deuteronomy. It says, "Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said. And the Lord will do to them what he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, whom he destroyed along with their land. The Lord will deliver them to you, and you must do to them all that I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." What wonderful words. What comforting words. You remember the story of how that God told Moses that you won't enter into the promised land. And so he gave a message to Moses before Moses left the Israelites, and God took him. And in this message, it was a message of comfort to them. He told the people, he says, "I won't go with you." Don't you know when they heard those words, they were terrifying words? Moses was their leader. Moses is the one that brought them up out of Egypt, and he was the leader when they fought Pharaoh and his army. He was their leader when they wandered through the wilderness and through all of the hard times and through the provisions that they were required for living. Moses was there to provide and to be their leader. And now he's saying, you cross over Jordan and conquer Canaan land. There's armies over there. You'll have to fight them. You'll have to conquer, but I'm not going with you. What a devastating message that would be. But he went on to comfort them. And he said, the Lord your God goes with you. He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. Just as God brought you up out of Egypt, and just as you fought in all the battles before, he'll go with you. He's not going to leave you, and he's not going to forsake you as you cross Jordan to fight for the land of Canaan. These words are repeated several times when the Israelites really had need of them, when they were facing tough battles and things looked difficult for them. God would tell them again, he says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Now we find Paul writing to the Hebrews saying, God said he'd never forsake us. He'd never leave us. He'd be with us. And you don't have to be discontent in life. You don't have to have problems in life that you feel are insurmountable, because God said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. I, out of interest, looked up the word thee in the King James Version. I found it's repeated 2,736 times. There's a lot of things which people say to us that we shouldn't take personally. Just let them go. But here is a verse with God speaking that we should take very personally. This is for us. Totally for us. If you want to think that it was written just for you, then that's a good qualification. That's fine. It's written for each and every one of us. I like how that Jesus took such concern for each individual when he was on this earth. He touched people and healed them. He didn't just wave his arms out over the crowd and say everybody's healed, but he went to them. He touched them. He talked with them. He lifted their burdens. He helped them in a very specific way. Personally, he helped them. I think of the woman who had an issue of blood and how she knew that if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be made well. And so she fought through the crowd and she reached down and reached it, and the healing virtue went through her body. She was healed. You know, Jesus wasn't satisfied with that. He wasn't satisfied for this anonymous healing taking place. He said, "Who touched me?" The disciples said, "Why, a lot of people probably touched you in this crowd." He said, "No." And the woman came forward and said, "It was me." And he talked to her. He wasn't content with just something happening and going on its way, but he wanted to reach out and make a personal contact with that lady. And he does that for us today. It's personal for us, each and every one. Let me read to you Matthew 10:29 and 30. "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows." In the day of Christ, a sparrow was sold for a very low price, a copper coin. That was a Roman coin, and it was less than a quarter in our money system of today. So for less than a quarter, you could buy 2 sparrows. And if you were poor and couldn't afford to sacrifice a sheep or a goat, you might bring a sparrow to the temple for your sacrifice. Maybe the widow lady was there to buy a couple of sparrows to make a sacrifice. Maybe the poor person would be able to find a quarter to make a sacrifice in the temple. I want you to listen to Luke's rendition of this and to what he added to it. In Luke the 12th chapter it said, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins? And not one of them is forgotten before God." Now, in Matthew it said you could buy 2 sparrows for 1 quarter. We'll term it that way. 2 sparrows for 1 quarter. And over in Luke it says you can get 5 sparrows for 2 quarters. You see what's going on here? You can get 2 of them for a quarter, but if you want to buy 4 of them for 2 quarters, we'll throw in a spare. You know, a freebie, an extra sparrow. And then it goes on and says, "And not one of them is forgotten before God." Even that sparrow, which was the freebie of no value, isn't forgotten of God. Even he remembers that 5th sparrow. He knows each and every one of them. Then he says, "But the very hairs of your head are all numbered." Now, I have just a little bit of a hair issue, what with having some hair loss, but I have never loved myself so much to try to number my hairs. I've never even tried to number the ones that fall out. But God loves each and every one of us so much that he numbers the very hairs of our head. That is incomprehensible. You talk about love, that is love in the extreme. He sees that sparrow of no value if it falls to the ground. He even sees how many hairs you have. That is a blessing to us. He loves every one of us that much. "Never will I leave you Never will I forsake you. This is an unalterable promise. This is a promise that doesn't depend on our actions. It stems from God's unfathomable love. It's in his nature to never leave us nor forsake us. God knows our frailties. He knows our fears. He knows our weaknesses. He knows our difficulties. He knew the job he was asking for when he made the promise to the Israelites, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. The Israelites, they had some huge problems. It's almost like a babysitting job when you're babysitting some uncontrollable kids. It's like, do you know what you're taking on here? God knew. From the very beginning of time in the Garden of Eve, he knew what human nature was like. He knew that man at times had great problems. The Israelites at times turned away from God and worshiped an idol. But God said, he still repeated it. He says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. You turn to me and I will bless you. I am still there. I haven't left anywhere. I'll still bless you in your difficulties if you just turn to me. He made this promise. He committed himself to it. And he wanted us to know that he has committed himself to it. He hasn't decided this thing in secret. He hasn't decided I'll try it, and if it fails, then nobody will know the difference. But he committed himself to it, and he told the Israelites that. Paul repeated it. He said God has committed himself to this fact that he'll never leave us nor forsake us, and it doesn't depend upon our actions. It is within his nature of love for us. It's an unalterable promise. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. That's a comprehensive promise. Did you know that a benefactor can leave us but not forsake us? To illustrate the point, let me share some personal experiences from my youth. This is Lillian Meek. Now, there probably aren't too many here this morning who remember her, but maybe a few of you do. I want to tell you about her. She lived in Guthrie over in the 900, actually be the 1000 block of West Warner. I have good memories of her. She lived by herself, she didn't drive, and she liked children. There were times during the summer months when her grandsons from Sepulpa, Terry, Jerry, Teddy, Meek, they would come down for several weeks during the summer and spend time with her, and we would go down and spend time at her place. There weren't just a whole lot of things for youngsters to do back then. I remember that Aunt Marie Miles, she had young people's meeting in the print shop house on Friday evenings, but I was too young to go to that. But I do remember sitting on Lillian Meek's front screened-in porch and listening to her tell ghost stories. Now, how much better than that can it get? The chapel was 3 blocks east of where she lived, and she would go down and clean the church during the week. And the church would pay her just a little bit of money to clean it. And I remember times that she would let us go with her and help her clean the church, and then she'd give us a little bit of money. And I know that was a sacrifice for her to share the money with these youngsters, but she did. She had such a heart for young people. There were times that I would leave the house early on Sunday morning so that I could walk to church, and I would go by her house and walk with her down the sidewalk on to church. And it was from her that I learned that if you would step on a crack on Sunday, it would break the devil's back. So as you can imagine, I stepped on quite a few cracks on Sunday mornings. There were a lot of things that I learned from her. She was the primary Sunday school teacher when I was little. So when I was real little, she taught me the story of Jesus, and at a little older age, she told me ghost stories. I was 15 years old when she came down sick and passed away. The young people lost a real friend when she passed away. And looking back on it, she had left us, but I didn't feel forsaken. I didn't feel deserted. She had been our friend, and she would always be a special person in our hearts and memories. You know, people can leave us without forsaking us. It's possible. You probably have people in your life, maybe parents or siblings or somebody that you were close to, and they left, and it hurt. They left us, but you didn't really feel forsaken by them. And then there's the situation where that people can turn their backs on us and forsake us and not leave us. And sometimes we wish they would leave us. But here's the promise. God said He wouldn't leave us and He wouldn't forsake us. You can't ask for better love and care than that. Unlike earthly relationships sometimes do, this relationship won't grow stale with time. And it won't end when time ends. Because this promise that God made, I will never leave you nor forsake you, it's an eternal promise. And it will be with us always. Amen.
You may be down and feel that God has somehow forgotten, that you are faced with circumstances you can't get through. Right now it seems there's no way out, and you're